public health officers are potentially infectious or what, but we will see what this is about in a second. This comes under Schedule 21 of the Coronavirus Act 2020. Now, we did say when the act was passed, if you were watching the UK column at the time, that this was an enabling act, and this guidance seems to give some clarification as to what it enables, published just a couple of days ago. So here we go. This is all about managing the spread of coronavirus, Patrick, and they're saying that the Coronavirus Act 2020 provides public health officers with powers to control the spread of coronavirus in the UK. Some of these powers existed already for England in the Health Protection Coronavirus Regulations 2020. However, the Act replaces these regulations with a consistent UK-wide approach and includes certain new powers for immigration officers and constables. They go on to say the relevant powers can only be used once the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care has issued a declaration, and such a declaration remains in force, that the incidence or transmission of coronavirus constitutes a serious or imminent threat to public health in England, and the measures set out in the Act are considered as an effective means of delaying or preventing further transmission of coronavirus in England. So it has to be stressed that these particular guidelines only apply to England, although just in the previous paragraph they were suggesting this was UK-wide. In fact, this particular document only applies to England. It does specify, though, that there are similar powers in place for the other parts of the UK, so there'll be similar guidelines in place. So the question is, what is a public health officer? Well, they give us a definition. A PHO is either an officer of the Secretary of State, e.g. an employment of Public Health England, or a registered public health consultant, so designated by the Secretary of State. So it goes on to say, if you've received a letter from Public Health England acting on behalf of the Secretary of State, which confirms that you've been designated as a registered public health consultant for the purposes of Schedule 21, then you will fall within the definition of a PHO and thus be able to exercise the relevant powers. So this implies, Patrick, some kind of private sector involvement in this. It's not clear, but the term consultant tends to imply private sector. Sorry.
Yeah, it seems like they're giving license for public health consultants or public health officials to be acting in almost a police capacity, Mike. So law enforcement, as it were. So, and the sort of powers that under the Mental Health Act, for instance, under sectioning. So this really is a big step forward with this whole coronavirus emergency framework.
And isn't it interesting that they're taking this step at the time we're supposedly coming out of it? So this is clearly in preparation for the so-called second wave.
So-called second wave, the predicted second wave. We're not sure how they could be so sure that it's coming, but this comes at a time when a lot of the top, I think the report just came out, Mike. We might not have the details of this right now, but I think it just came out yesterday. The top 150 municipalities, local authorities in the country, top tier local authorities, pretty much COVID-free. Pretty much COVID-free. In terms of Devon, 8 infections or something like this. I'm not sure what it is, but you'll see similar numbers like this, or large geographical areas with just a handful of so-called cases. So, and like you said, now it's just disappearing, it's tailing off, and all of these new regulations and powers are coming in.
Now the question in the chat box is what qualifications are needed to be a PHO. This is not defined. It goes on to say Schedule 21 Parts 1 and 2 also include powers for constables and immigration officers to support the function of PHOs. So PHOs aren't supporting the functions of constables and immigration officers, quite the opposite. So this we'll explain why that's necessary in 1 second. It says a person is potentially infectious if the person is or may be infected or contaminated with coronavirus, and there is a risk that the person might infect or contaminate others. So you don't have to have had a positive test. It's only if there is doubt there. It's if you may be infectious, and the person has been in an affected area within the 14 days preceding that time. Sorry, that's an or, not an and. Now, just to define what an infected area is, that refers to any country, territory, or any other area outside the UK that the Secretary of State has declared for this purpose in a notice on gov.uk. Now, we'll be coming on to the countries outside the UK that the Secretary of State seems to have already declared
That's right.
are problematic. But this is really key. So this is about internal to the UK and also people coming into the UK. It goes on to say this, 3.7, implementation of your powers will be done at a local level, coordinating with local resilience partners in accordance with local arrangements. So this is not being handled at a national level. This is being handled at a local level. Your local authority is in charge. Of course, local resilience partners said, well, these partnerships have been being established for a very long time now. They're well established. The UK column has been talking about them for a number of years. Of particular concern are the multi-agency public protection arrangements that we've been talking about for a long time. It goes on to say this, if a person is not willing to comply voluntarily with any instructions, a PHO should first have a conversation. If the person is still not compliant, then you should invoke the powers conferred on you by the Act. It says 3.9e, where will the person be taken for screening and assessment? This facility must be suitable for screening and assessment. This could be an isolation facility, an NHS facility, or any other agreed facility as long as it's suitable for screening and assessment. So you'll be taken off somewhere, sometimes with the help of the police, sometimes perhaps with the help of an immigration officer, but that's not necessarily the case in every instance. And it also applies to children. So 6.2, you may only exercise your powers on a child in the presence of A, an individual who has responsibility for the child, or B, if no such adult is present, an adult that you consider to be appropriate, having regard to the views of the child. This is quite unbelievably concerning, and people should be asking many questions about this. So a PHO can come along and remove a child with an adult that they consider to be appropriate.
All based on whether there's a suspicion that you might be infected or that you may have been in an infected, quote, area in the last 14 days.
Absolutely.
So maybe, if, might, possibly.
Possibly.
We don't know.
Perhaps. Absolutely. It goes on to say this. Individuals should always be given the opportunity to comply voluntarily with public health advice. So it is purely voluntary, except where it isn't, because it then says it is only at the stage where individuals do not comply with such advice that we would look to impose measures under Schedule 21, Parts 1 and 2. So this is absolutely mandatory. There's no choice in this, but don't worry, you'll be given the choice. You'll be given the opportunity to make the right choice before they haul you off against your will.
Is that not classic doublespeak right there, 9.1 and 9.2? There's nothing voluntary about that. They're saying voluntary in the first clause, and in the second they're saying no, actually no, it's not voluntary. We're only giving you a chance to volunteer yourself. That's not voluntary.
Yeah, don't worry, Patrick, we live in a democracy, except we don't. Right. I mean, that's absolutely clear there. And just to summarize this from another part of the document, public health officers may direct, remove, or request a constable to remove an individual to a place suitable for screening and assessment. That is the situation. Now, when the legislation was originally enacted and published, we did highlight this at the time, but these guidelines make it somewhat clearer because, of course, the legislation is in a particular, it's in legalese. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do to interpret it. And in fact, to interpret it, you've got to understand a whole bunch of other legislation as well. This makes it absolutely clear in black and white. So what does Simon Dolan